The galaxy was at war again, and the Zeekter Armada was winning, just like always. Their fleets moved like storms through space, burning worlds and leaving only ash. On the screens of alien news networks, massive battles played out with blinding flashes of plasma fire and the glow of shattered planets. Every species watched, and none dared to challenge them. Humanity kept quiet. Earth's small fleet and old weapons could never match the Armada's strength. So they stayed out of sight and minded their own business. But far from public eyes, deep under the thick ice of Antarctica, something was being built. A ship, not a missile, not anything the galaxy had seen before. In a long steel tunnel, longer than any skyscraper was tall, a giant barrel of smooth metal rested in silence. Cables as thick as tree trunks ran along its sides. Strange glowing coils lined the interior. Engineers in heavy suits moved carefully. Between humming machines, checking screens, and calling out numbers, the project had no official name on any record, but the people who worked on it called it Project Thunderline. It was humanity's first railgun, a weapon that could throw a solid piece of metal so fast that no shield, no armor, and no ship in the galaxy could stop it. The weapon had been years in secret construction. Only the highest leaders of Earth knew it existed. The design was so powerful that even human scientists had argued it might be impossible to fire without tearing itself apart. But tonight, under the frozen ground, it was ready for the first test. The control room was dim, filled, with the low hum of power flowing through the coils. The chief engineer, a woman with tired eyes and oil on her hands, stared at a single blinking light on the firing panel. She had waited for this moment her whole life. The targeting officer looked up from his screen and said in a flat voice, "Target locked." The room fell silent. In the distance, far out in the cold dark of space, an old asteroid drifted between Mars and Jupiter. It was nothing important, just a rock. But it had been chosen as the railgun's first victim. Far across the galaxy, no one noticed anything. Yet the alien armadas continued their wars. Admirals toasted 2 easy victories. But in certain hidden military stations, sensors twitched. A faint spike in magnetic energy flashed across their data screens. It was small at first, so small it could have been a glitch, but then it grew and grew until alarms began to scream. Engineers in alien warships frowned at the readings. No known weapon had ever produced a spike like this. The source seemed to come from a small, quiet system at the edge of the Orion Arma system, with a yellow sun and a blue planet that most of the galaxy ignored. The Zeektar ignored it too, until now. Back under Antarctica, the final checks were done. The power levels were higher than safe limits, but there was no turning back. A deep vibration began to roll through the tunnel as the coils charged. Sound was low, almost like the growl of a giant animal waking up. Lights along the barrel shifted from green to blue, then to a blinding white. The chief engineer's voice was steady when she gave the order. Fire. There was no explosion, no blast of fire. Instead, there was a sharp, heavy thunk as the railgun released its first projectile. A solid slug of tungsten shot forward at a speed so great that air itself split apart in a shockwave. In space, there was nothing to slow it down. The slug tore through the void like a silent arrow. It's invisible to the eye, but unstoppable. At the asteroid's surface, the slug hit in less than a minute. There was no warning, no visible beam to track. 1 second the asteroid was there. The next, a perfect round tunnel had been punched straight through it from one side to the other. The force sent massive chunks drifting into space. Human scientists watched the screens with wide eyes. They had expected power, but this was beyond numbers. The railgun had fired with such force that it could have pierced the hull of the largest battleship in the galaxy. Back in alien territory, the magnetic spike vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Confusion spread in command rooms. Some thought it was a new type of warp test. Others whispered about ancient weapons lost to history. No one guessed the truth. Earth remained silent. The humans in the control room celebrated quietly, some hugging, some laughing in disbelief, But the commanders did not smile. They knew what this weapon meant. The moment they used it in a real battle, the whole galaxy would turn its eyes toward Earth. They also knew that someday soon, they would have no choice but to use it. Deep underground, the railgun's coils slowly cooled. Above the frozen continent was still, the wind howling over ice as if nothing had happened. But somewhere in the darkness between stars, the first thread of fear had begun to weave through the galaxy. Humanity had just built a weapon that no one else could stop, and no one else even knew it existed yet. In the center of a massive alien war council, dozens of species gathered around a floating holographic map of the galaxy. The air was thick with tension and the glow of battle reports. Admiral Kester, towering in his black armor, stood at the head of the table with a smirk that showed his jagged teeth. He spoke proudly of their latest victories, mocking the smaller civilizations who dared to resist. His words were cruel and confident, his tone dripping with contempt. When someone mentioned humanity, he laughed loudly. Humans were not warriors in his eyes. Their fleet was small, their technology outdated, their name barely mentioned in war reports. To him, they were no more than a primitive side note in the grand history of the galaxy. But then, in the middle of his speech, a quiet voice interrupted. It came from a young officer who hurried into the room, clutching a data slate. "Admiral," the officer said, his voice shaking, "we just lost a cruiser. In deep space." Instantly, the room went silent. Kester's smirk faded into a frown. "A cruiser? How?" the officer stammered. We don't know. One moment it was on patrol, the next moment gone. A perfect hole through the center of the ship. No warning, no energy weapon detected, no missile trail. The council erupted in confusion. Generals shouted for sensor data. Scientists leaned over the officer's slate, their eyes wide. A replay from the cruiser's last moments flickered into the air. It showed the ship cruising calmly through the dark wind, without any visible attack. A blinding flash burst from its midsection. The camera feed cut to static. Slow motion revealed nothing. No beam, no torpedo, no approaching fighter. Only a blur too fast to see, followed by destruction. Far from that council, deep under Antarctica, the Railgun crew watched. The news feed on private screens. Their first real target had been chosen carefully. The cruiser had been far enough from any major fleet to avoid suspicion, yet important enough to send a message. The targeting officer had locked onto it from millions of kilometers away. The slug had taken less than 2 minutes to cross the distance. Now the crew sat in quiet awe, their cheers from earlier replaced by a strange silence. The chief engineer ran her hands slowly over the console, as if she couldn't believe the machine was real. "One shot," she whispered, "and it's gone." Across the galaxy, panic began to grow. Military analysts tried to explain what happened, but none of their theories made sense. A few suggested it could be an ancient relic weapon from the lost wars of the First Age, but those had been myths for centuries. Some suspected the work of rogue scientists with impossible technology. Yet no one dared to mention Earth. Humanity had kept so far from galactic politics that the idea seemed laughable. And still, the thought crept quietly into the minds of a few paranoid commanders. What if the quiet species at the edge of the Orion Arm had teeth they had never shown? In the Human Control Center, the celebration of success was short. The railgun's power readings showed strain. Firing it again so soon would risk serious damage. Commanders in sharp uniforms argued in hushed voices about whether to hide the weapon for now or make a show of strength. The room smelled faintly of heated metal and ozone from the last firing. Screens displayed repair schedules, coil cooldown times, and a list of potential future targets. Outside the thick walls, the Antarctic wind roared above. Unaware that something under the ice had just shaken the most powerful military in the galaxy. Back in the Alien Council chamber, the debate turned into anger. Kester slammed his clawed hand against the table, demanding answers. He swore revenge on whoever dared strike his fleet. Then another officer rushed in, pale and trembling. "Admiral, we've just lost the flagship Vorak. The room froze again. A flagship was not just a ship, was a symbol of dominance. A fortress bristling with weapons and guarded by the best pilots in the armada. The officer's voice cracked as he explained. Same as before. No warning, no sign of an attack. A single perfect hole through the bridge. All hands lost. This time there was no laughter. The council knew this was no accident. Someone, somewhere, had a weapon they could not see or stop. Rumors spread like wildfire through the fleets. Captains ordered their crews to keep scanning space for invisible projectiles. But the truth was, if that slug was coming for them, they would never know until it hit. In the darkness of the Antarctic base, the railgun's coils began to hum. Again, cooling systems working to bring it back to full power. The next shot would not be a test. It would be a statement. And for the first time in decades, the galaxy's most feared admiral felt something he had never known in battle unease. Alien news networks burned with the same images all day and night. In every corner of the galaxy, giant holographic displays replayed the moment the Zector flagship died. Some feeds slowed the footage down until every frame could be seen. But there was still nothing, no beam, no missile. Nothing that explained how a perfect hole had been punched through one of the strongest warships ever built. Commentators argued endlessly. Military experts called it impossible. Others gave it a name, the Ghost Spear. It was a weapon no one could see, no one could block, and no one could survive. The name spread faster than any official explanation. And as the fear grew, so did curiosity. If this mysterious attacker could destroy an armored flagship from unimaginable distance, who would be next? In dozens of alien capitals, leaders summoned their military chiefs. They demanded answers. Spies were sent to the wreckage sites, but there was nothing to recover just. Drifting metal, vaporized electronics, and a neat round tunnel carved clean through each ship. Even the Armada's most advanced scanning drones came back with no sign of radiation or energy residue. Whatever this weapon was, it didn't work like any known technology. Across the council chambers of the great powers, one name came up more often than any other. Not as an accusation, but as a quiet, nagging suspicion. Earth most dismissed the idea immediately. Humans had no history of building such advanced weapons, and they avoided galactic wars whenever possible. They had small fleets, outdated ship designs, and no known research in extreme-range weaponry. But a few high-ranking officials remembered the way humanity fought in the old pirate skirmishes decades ago precise. Patient and terrifyingly determined when pushed, under the Antarctic ice. The Railgun control center glowed in the dim light of screens and status bars. The crew was tired but restless. The last two shots had changed everything. Before, they were a secret project. Now, without revealing themselves, they had shaken the balance of power across the galaxy. The targeting officer leaned back in his chair, scrolling through a long list of alien fleet movements. "They're all looking this way now," he muttered. The chief engineer was already checking the barrel's alignment. The coils were stable again. The system was ready for another shot. But in the command chamber, Earth's military leaders argued over their next move. Some wanted to keep the weapon hidden for as long as possible. Others believed they should strike again harder and more openly to send a message before anyone dared to challenge them. The room was thick with tension. They all knew that once they revealed themselves, there would be no going back. In deep space, the Zector Armada scrambled to protect its remaining fleets. Patrol routes were changed. Warships traveled in tight formations, hoping that multiple shields could block an invisible attack. But it didn't matter. The next strike came faster than anyone expected. A Zector battleship, moving through warp toward a reinforcement zone, was hit mid-jump. The slug didn't just pierce, it disrupted the warp field entirely, tearing the ship in half before it ever reappeared in real space. Alien scientists stared at the data in shock. This was no simple weapon. Whoever built it had the ability to hit moving targets across impossible distances. Even through the distortion of faster-than-light travel, the news broke instantly. Panic spread through the Armada's ranks. Entire fleets slowed their movement. To avoid making themselves easy targets, Recruitment dropped as soldiers began to fear their enemy more than their commanders. In the alien capitals, public protests demanded action. Some called for peace talks with whoever owned the ghost spear. Others demanded full-scale retaliation against anyone suspected. That suspicion now turned sharply toward Earth. Spy ships were sent toward the Sol system, their stealth drives active and their hulls coated in sensor-jamming alloys. But they would find no easy path. Humanity's listening stations picked up the intruders long before they reached the inner planets. Orders were given quietly. None of the spies would make it back. In the Galactic High Council's one decision rose above the rest, a coalition fleet would be sent to the Sol system. It would be the largest military force ever assembled in peacetime, hundreds of warships from half a dozen species. United by fear of the unknown, their mission was simple: identify the weapon, take it, or destroy it. The order was signed without hesitation. Across the stars, massive engines ignited, and a swarm of warships turned toward the little yellow sun at the edge of known space. In Antarctica, the hum of the railgun's coils grew louder, almost like the machine could sense what was coming. The crew didn't need a briefing to understand. They had seen the fleet mobilizing on the long-range scans. The targeting officer tapped the display showing the incoming ships. "They're not here to talk," he said quietly. The chief engineer gave a slow nod. "Then we'll give them a welcome they'll never forget." Far above, the icy wind swept across the frozen land, covering every trace of the weapon hidden. Below, but in the darkness of space, the first step toward war had already been taken. The galaxy was no longer curious. It was coming straight for Earth. The first shadows of the alien fleet appeared on the long-range scopes like a storm crawling over the edge of the sky. Hundreds of warships, each one armed with enough firepower to erase cities, moved in tight formation. They didn't hide their approach. They wanted Earth to see them coming. The coalition fleet had crossed light years without slowing, their engines burning like angry stars in the void. In their command decks, alien officers believed the humans would panic, that they would scramble their small, outdated navy and beg for talks. But Earth was silent. No war broadcasts, no open channels, no public fear. To the coalition, it was unsettling. To the people inside the underground base in Antarctica, it was expected. Orders were sent to every human ship in the system. Fighters, corvettes, and missile frigates gathered near Jupiter, forming a thin defensive screen. They were hopelessly outnumbered, but their position wasn't random. The railgun had been moved piece by massive piece into a hidden platform, orbiting Jupiter's icy moon Callisto. The move had taken weeks of secret work, but it gave the weapon something priceless: range. From this position, the Railgun could strike before the coalition fleet even reached the asteroid belt. In the underground control center, the air was sharp with the cold hiss of recycled oxygen. Crew members moved quickly between stations, checking and rechecking systems. The chief engineer stood at the firing console, her hands resting lightly on the controls. The targeting officer was silent, his eyes fixed on the growing wall of red dots on his display. Outside the base, Jupiter loomed. In the background, its massive storms swirling like endless oceans. Somewhere far away, deep in the black, the enemy fleet drew closer. The first coil charge order came through. The railgun's long barrel began to hum, its vibration a deep, steady pulse that seemed to sink into the bones of everyone nearby. The coalition fleet didn't expect the attack so soon. Their forward scout ships were still scanning the asteroid belt when the first slug was fired. It crossed the distance in less than 90 seconds. There was no warning, only the sudden, silent destruction of a cruiser at the fleet's edge. The slug tore through it so cleanly that for a moment the ship continued moving before its broken pieces drifted apart. Panic swept through the enemy. Formation. Captains ordered evasive maneuvers, but the second slug was already on its way. This one hit a destroyer in the center of the formation, the shockwave scattering smaller ships like leaves in a storm. The aliens fired back wildly, filling space with plasma bolts and missile swarms, but none of it came close to the hidden railgun. Human fighters darted in and out of the chaos, drawing fire away from the weapon and forcing the enemy to split their attention. A third slug ripped through the shields of a battleship, sending its wreckage spinning into Jupiter's gravity well. The fleet slowed, regrouping outside the range they thought was safe. That pause gave humanity time to breathe, but not for long. The railgun's coils were running dangerously hot. The chief engineer's readings flashed yellow across her console. Firing again without a cooldown could burn out critical systems. In the war room, Earth's generals debated over the comes. Some urged to keep shooting until the fleet was broken. Others argued for patience. But the coalition had no intention of waiting. Their formation shifted, and then the largest ships surged forward, engines roaring as they charged toward Jupiter. If they could get close enough, it could overwhelm the defenders before the railgun could fire again. The decision was made. The cooling cycle was cut short. Power surged into the weapon, and the coils lit with blinding light. The targeting officer's voice was calm, but his eyes were sharp. Flagship locked. The slug left the barrel with a deep, thunderous crack. Moments later, the coalition flagship's front half disintegrated, the rest tumbling away in a cloud of fire and metal. The victory came at a price. Warning lights flared in the railgun chamber. Systems had overheated, and sections of the barrel were glowing faintly red. Repairs would take hours they didn't have. The coalition still had numbers on their side, and their ships were closing the gap. On the scopes, their wall of red dots was now a tide rushing straight for Earth. Human forces fell back toward the inner planets, drawing the enemy with them. In the shadows of Callisto's orbit, the wounded railgun powered down, waiting for the moment it could roar again. The next round would decide everything. The sky above Earth's defense line was a storm of light and fire. Plasma blasts cut through the dark like burning rivers, and missile trails curled in long arcs before bursting into clouds of shrapnel. Human fighters weaved between the beams, their engines screaming as they dodged and struck, but the coalition fleet kept coming. Every kilometer they closed brought them nearer to the inner planets and the railgun's last defensive line. In the war room under Antarctica, the air was tense and heavy. The railgun's coils were still cooling from the desperate overcharge at Jupiter. Technicians worked frantically, their hands moving across glowing panels, forcing the systems to recover faster than they were ever designed to. The chief engineer's voice was low but urgent. If we push it now, it might tear itself apart. The commander's reply was just as firm. If we don't, Earth tears apart first.
Out in
space, the coalition had shifted tactics. Instead of advancing in a single wall, their ships split into 3 massive wedges, each trying to punch through a different part of the human defense line. The largest wedge drove straight for the railgun's hidden position, betting that destroying it would break human resistance completely. Human frigates sacrificed themselves to slow the advance, but the alien ships were relentless. On the scopes, the distance between them and the railgun's range was shrinking fast. The targeting officer's voice was calm, but his grip on the console was tight. We'll only get 1 clean shot before they're on top of us. The order came. The coils lit up again, their glow filling the chamber with an unearthly blue light. But this time, something was different. The projectile waiting inside the barrel wasn't the standard tungsten slug. It was experimental, still untested outside. A lab at its core packed with a miniature gravity well. The engineers called it the gravity slug. On impact, it would not just pierce a target, it would collapse space around it for a brief moment, pulling everything nearby into a crushing void. The chief engineer hesitated for only a second before entering the firing code. When the railgun fired, the shockwave rattled the chamber. In space, the gravity slug cut through the dark faster than thought. It slammed into the lead ship of the advancing wedge, and the effect was immediate. A black sphere bloomed where the ship had been, pulling in wreckage, fighters, and even parts of nearby cruisers. Metal twisted and vanished into the singularity before it snapped shut with a silent flash, leaving nothing but drifting fragments. The coalition fleet faltered. For the first time, they hesitated. Human ships seized the moment, surging forward to push the invaders back. Missile salvos struck retreating vessels, and railgun slug standard ones now punched holes in fleeing destroyers. Across alien channels, panicked voices shouted warnings about the new ammunition. The Coalition had expected a hidden cannon. They had not expected a weapon that could rip open space itself. The fear was contagious. Ships began breaking formation, commanders arguing whether to press on or flee, but victory was not yet certain. The gravity slug had drained enormous power from the railgun. Coolant systems screamed under the strain, and parts of the barrel glowed red-hot. The weapon could not fire again for several minutes. The Coalition's second and third wedges regrouped, swinging wide to avoid the railgun's line of fire. Human forces raced to intercept, their smaller ships darting between massive battleships. Trying to hold the line in the control center, the commander studied the battle map. The alien fleet was still larger, still dangerous, but it was bleeding. Ships faster than it could regroup. The first wedge was gone, erased by the gravity slug. The others were being forced back toward the edge of the system. The moment the Coalition realized they could not win without unacceptable losses, they began to withdraw. Engines flared as their warships turned, limping back into deep space. The railgun remained silent, but its presence hung over the retreat, like a shadow. When the last enemy signal faded from human sensors, the crew finally let themselves breathe. The railgun had survived, Earth had survived. But in the back of everyone's mind was the same unspoken truth. The weapon was no longer a secret. Every power in the galaxy now knew humanity had something that could change wars forever. And somewhere, out there, plans were already being made to destroy it before it could be used again. The victory had bought time, but not safety. The next battle would come, and when it did, the railgun would have to fire once more, this time against enemies. Who knew exactly what it could do? The weeks after the battle were strangely quiet. The Coalition fleet was gone, driven back into deep space, but no one on Earth believed the danger had passed. Across the galaxy, every major power now knew the truth: the humans had a weapon. Unlike anything else, a cannon that could strike from impossible distances and even tear open the fabric of space itself. The alien news networks spoke of it with equal parts fear and fascination. The Ghost Spear was no longer a rumor. It was a fact, and facts could start wars. In the underground war room beneath Antarctica, the commanders reviewed long-range sensor data every hour. Small fleets were moving in the shadows of distant systems. Spy probes were detected and destroyed before they could get close. Human engineers worked without rest, repairing the railgun's overheated sections and building a second firing platform, hidden even deeper in the asteroid belt. They all knew it was only a matter of time before someone tried again. What they didn't know was that the next threat wouldn't come from inside the galaxy, it would come from beyond it. The first warning was faint, a spike in gravitational waves, stronger than anything measured before. Then came the second signal from an old human listening post far beyond Pluto. The message was short and broken, but the words were enough. To silence the room, unknown weapon, charging, targeted at Sol. The data showed something massive deep in another galaxy. Aligning with the Milky Way, it was bigger than any starship, bigger than any station, and it was pointed directly at Earth. There was no time for diplomacy. The railgun team was brought back to full readiness. This would not be a battle against a fleet, they would get only one shot. Engineers worked around the clock, pushing. The weapon systems passed every safety limit. The barrel was reinforced with new alloys, the coils rewired to carry more power than they were ever designed for. The targeting calculations alone took hours, factoring in intergalactic distance, the movement of stars, and the drift of the weapon's massive target. When the numbers were final, the targeting officer looked up from his console, his face pale. "If we miss," he said quietly, "we won't get another chance." The firing order came. The railgun's coils lit brighter than they ever had before, bathing the chamber in blinding white light. The gravity slug in the barrel was larger than any they had fired, its core so dense it strained the containment fields holding it in place. The vibration in the floor grew into a deep, rattling hum. Even the air seemed to shake. "The chief engineers?" The voice was steady, but her hands were tight on the controls. "Firing in 3, 2, 1. The sound was like a thunderclap inside a cave. The slug left the barrel and vanished into the dark, crossing more distance in seconds than any human made. Object in history. For hours afterward, Earth could do nothing but wait. Then, weeks later, the signal came in from a deep-range observation probe. It showed a flash bright enough to outshine the stars around it, and then the target was gone. The unknown weapon had been destroyed before it could fire. Across the galaxy, the message was clear. Humanity could strike anywhere. No fleet was too large, no distance too far. The Ghost Spear was now the most feared weapon in known space. In alien capitals, leaders argued whether to fight humanity or leave them alone. Some saw them as a threat to be eliminated, others as an ally too dangerous to betray. On Earth, there were no celebrations, only quiet relief. The Railgun crew knew the truth. This was just the beginning. Power like this would always draw enemies. In the frozen silence above Antarctica, the weapon rested once more, hidden beneath miles of ice. Its coils were cold now, its barrel still. But every person in that room understood that someday soon it would fire again. And when it did, the galaxy would feel the shock for years to come.